not afraid of the coldest rain. Gives me away from the golden days. I'm not afraid, I don't feel the pain. Lead me to the golden gate.
My name is Sean Merrill, and I'm one of your Region 6 governors. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Bill Gutman to CECON 2020 in our Region 6 Assembly. I'd like to thank ASCE Region 6 Director Jerry Paz for putting us in touch with Dr. Gutman, and I'd like to thank the CECON Planning Committee for opening the program to include a session that benefits all of ASCE Region 6 and beyond. Dr. Bill Gutman has been the Director of Aerospace Operations at Spaceport America since October 2009. He's also provided technical support for the development of the spaceport since the mid-1990s through a contract with New Mexico State University. As Aerospace Operations Director, his major responsibilities are to oversee flight safety, to facilitate customer operations, to maintain FAA launch site operator license, and to assist with infrastructure planning and development. Prior to joining the spaceport, Dr. Gutman was employed by the New Mexico State University. He was employed by the New Mexico State University's Physical Science Laboratory and worked on diverse projects such as research and propagation of high-power laser radiation, investigation of the optical properties of military smoke materials, development of optical instrumentation systems, and development of risk assessment methodologies for aviation and space launch systems. Dr. Gutman earned his PhD in optical and molecular physics from Ohio State University. With that, Dr. Gutman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for that introduction. Again, I'm the Director of Aerospace Operations at Spaceport America, and I'm going to tell you about our facility. We're always pleased to talk about the facility. So first I'm going to share my screen and show you the slides and talk through some of these things for you. Let me find the right screen here. Where is it? Why does it always do this? There it is. Okay, and now let me go to full screen. Okay, so again, my title is Director of Aerospace Operations, and so we have a little joke internally. If it stays on the ground, it belongs to the facilities guy. If it flies, it's mine, and if we haven't landed it yet, then it's business development. So we have a very robust program, I think, and first thing I want to do is tell you a little bit about the history of space in New Mexico, and to give you an idea of why we were interested in developing a spaceport here in the first place. So New Mexico actually goes back a long way in space activity. In the 1930s, Robert Goddard, he was a professor in Massachusetts, and he set one too many cornfields on fire with his liquid rocket experiments. And so he decided he needed another place, and he chose Roswell before Roswell became famous for other types of things that fly in the sky. And so he basically invented liquid rocketry there. And in fact, later on, Dr. von Braun from the German rocket development process or agency commented that basically Goddard had invented everything that needed to be invented. From that point on, all it was perfecting the designs. So then continuing in that vein, after World War II, those V-2s that the Germans had developed as a weapon of war were brought to the United States, some of them, after they were captured. And of course, we were interested in catching up with the rocket technology as a weapon, but we also started to see some of the potential for doing some real science with those things. So in my opinion, the earliest space science experiments that were done were when somebody decided, hey, let's poke a hole in the nose cone and put a camera inside one of those V-2s and see what the Earth looks like. And I've seen that video. It's really neat. It's grainy black and white, but for the first time, humans actually saw the blackness of space and the curvature of the Earth. Then continuing on, all through the 1950s, there was a very robust program at White Sands Missile Range involving sounding rockets. The term sounding rockets is a bit of a misnomer. A lot of them are done for atmospheric sounding purposes, but a better term would be research rockets, rockets that are launched suborbitally for almost any purpose that you could imagine research-wise. In the 1960s, NASA was very busy developing the beginnings of Project Apollo to get us to the moon. and they needed places to test some of the hardware that was under development. And so they partnered with WSMR and in fact developed, WSMR of course is White Sands Missile Range. They partnered and developed a standalone test facility, which technically is on WSMR land, but it's at the extreme west side. And so many different kinds of hardware were done there. For example, the lunar ascent and descent engines for the lunar module were tested in a big vacuum chamber at that facility. And they still do lots and lots of work in research for NASA, especially things that are hazardous enough that they need to be done farther away from major population centers. In the 1980s, probably the most important thing or the biggest claim to fame that we had in this area for space was that the space shuttle landed at White Sands Missile Range one time. Every mission of the space shuttle landed either in California or in Florida, except that one, when the weather was not suitable in Florida and the dry lake bed in California was underwater during an El Nino year. So it landed at White Sands Missile Range. In the 90s, then, New Mexico, seeing some of the potential here, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later, developed something called the Office for Space Commercialization within its Economic Development Department. And the purpose for that was to explore the possibility of space facilities in New Mexico, commercial space facilities, that is, and then to pursue the development of them. In the 2000 timeframe, in 2005, the New Mexico Spaceport Authority was created, and that's the organization for which I currently work. So the authority was different from the Office for Space Commercialization in that it can actually build and develop infrastructure and issue bonds and do all the kinds of things that you need to have a real facility. So in 2006, we did our first launch from Spaceport America. In 2007, we had our first launch that reached space. And in 2009, we began the construction of the facilities that I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of here in the next few minutes. And in 2012, we conducted our first licensed launch from the spaceport. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about what that means to be licensed a little later. So here's where we are. This is, you can see New Mexico in the US map, and then the spaceport is in the southwestern quadrant of New Mexico. And that big expanse of blue that you see there is White Sands Missile Range. That is an incredible national asset. It's roughly 40 miles wide by 100 miles long. And it's the largest piece of DoD land in the country. And in that facility, they've tested everything from those original V2s to almost every military missile system that has been developed, at least in one shape or another. Again, our location there nearby is no accident, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So here's the spaceport boundary. Now this looks weird because this is a Google Earth image with the boundary of the spaceport superimposed. You can see our airfield there at the top, and the mention was made of Jerry Paz. So Jerry Paz's firm, Moles and Corbin, actually designed our airfield, and so that's they have a lot of interest in this facility, and we always like to give them credit for that. So again, it looks very irregular. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but the next picture will make it a little clearer. So here it is superimposed on a map that shows land ownership. So in this particular map, white corresponds to BLM land, federal land that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Blue corresponds to land that's owned and managed by the New Mexico State Land Office. The pink at the right is White Sands Missile Range, and then the amber colored sections are actually privately owned land. So as you can see in this particular area, there is very little private land. And it turns out that the overlay of the spaceport there, that's actually pink overlying blue. And so that's the reason. The spaceport is located on land which is owned and managed by the New Mexico State Land Office. The reason for that is, for one thing, the state agency is a bit easier to work with than the federal agency. And secondly, the fees, the revenues that we generate flow into the state system. So at the time of statehood, New Mexico, like many other states, were given a lot of land. And in many cases, there's sort of a cookie cutter pattern, which is 4 sections per township. And there aren't a lot of places, if you look at a farther out map, you'll see that very recurring pattern. There aren't a lot of places that have large contiguous blocks. Well, obviously, to build a spaceport, contiguous land is important. It's highly beneficial. So we were looking for a place that had a large contiguous block. We also wanted it to be in a sparsely populated area, and we wanted it to be close to the Army White Sands Missile Range for the purpose of being able to use the airspace that they control and to use the instrumentation that they have. Under something called the Commercial Space Launch Act, the government ranges are actually required to make available surplus time and instrumentation capabilities to private and state launches, provided that it's done on a cost reimbursable and a time available basis. So it's a great advantage to us to have White Sands Missile Range off there to our east, because again, we have the airspace that we can use, and we also have the instrumentation. And in fact, the airspace, it's not shown on this map, but the airspace actually extends well to the west. So we are actually within the airspace that White Sands Missile Range controls. So this is what Spaceport America looked like in 2009, before we had turned any shovel of dirt. It's typical New Mexico, southern New Mexico desert scrub. And a lot of lessons are to be learned from this photo. A lot of construction companies learned some of those lessons. So, you know, it's great to have such a place. But, you know, if you're out there working on something and you realize, oops, I need another box of 1/4-20 nuts, it's not quite so easy to get those things. It's a 40-minute drive to the nearest town, which has a hardware store. And that's a rather small town. It's a full hour if you want to get to Las Cruces, where you have a much higher chance of finding a hardware store and where we have Lowe's and Home Depot. So to turn this into what amounts to a small city was no small challenge. So we broke ground to build the facilities in 2009. And now, in truth, we actually had a meager facility before that. We had a vertical launch facility that was able to launch certain vertical rockets, but nothing like the pictures that I'm going to show you here. So here is actually a little video that gives you an idea of the major facilities that we have at the spaceport. Hopefully this will work. Whoops, it didn't work. Now what's going on here? Okay, now it's working. So after we finish the video, I'll tell you a little bit about what you're seeing here. Okay, so the spaceport is loosely divided into three major areas. We refer to them as the horizontal launch area, and that video was primarily focused on the horizontal launch area. Then we have the vertical launch area, where we launch rockets that look like people think rockets should look. You know, they're long cylindrical things, and the fire comes out the tail and they go straight up. In the horizontal launch area, we're launching things like the Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2, which is actually carried up by an airplane. So a much different kind of vehicle architecture. Then we have a third area that we refer to as the advanced technology area. And it's down in the extreme southern part of the spaceport. And it's generally used by customers that need isolation, either because of secrecy of their program or because of potential hazards associated with the program. So those are what comprise it. Now, the building we're looking at right now is one of three major structures that we have in the horizontal launch area. This is called the Terminal and Hangar Facility. And as the name implies, it has both a terminal and a hangar. That's an interesting challenge from a fire code perspective, because to put those two disparate functions in the same physical structure requires a lot of additional thought. So the hangar part of the building actually has three totally independent fire suppression systems, and it has a very highly rated firewall. It's about as high as you can get, a firewall that separates the two parts. The glass section, it doesn't look like that anymore. This was a few years ago before Virgin had started fitting it out, but that houses the terminal part. So in the middle floor is mission control. The top floor is for the astronauts, the people who are going to be flying to space with Virgin Galactic. And unlike being an airline traveler, there are some medical constraints and things. And so there will be some medical testing and a certain amount of training. so that they can safely get out of their seats during weightlessness and those sorts of things. So that all takes place in the third floor. Again, mission control on the second floor. And then the first floor is sort of a lounge area for friends and family. So if you're going to spend a lot of money, $250,000 to fly to space, there's a good chance that you're going to bring a few family members or friends along with you to watch this. And so there will be restaurant facilities and things like that in that lower floor. And that's all completed now as we near the activation of the program. But that's what this building looks like. Then around to the sides are the hangar doors. And the hangar is what we would refer to as a flow-through hangar. So there are doors on both sides, and an aircraft can actually pass all the way through without having to be pushed out backwards. So that isn't really being used very much, but it can be a great advantage because it's much safer usually to go forward than it is to start backing things up. The hangar has about 45,000 square feet of floor space, and it's large enough so that the Virgin Galactic system that we will talk a little bit more about here shortly consists of an aircraft, a carrier aircraft to carry their space vehicle up to high altitude, and then the spaceship that separates and flies on its own into space. And the hangar is actually large enough to have 2 of the aircraft and 5 of the spaceships, provided that 2 of those 5 are actually attached to the airplanes. And just to give you an idea of the size of the airplane, the wingspan is about the same as a 737. Okay, so here we can see from the south side looking north, one of the hangar doors is roughly halfway open, and it's, again, a very large hangar. And from the other side, now we can see one hangar door is open just a little bit, and there you can see the Virgin Galactic carrier aircraft in place. So we've learned a lot of lessons with this project, and I'm sure every engineer knows this, but in putting up a building, right angles and straight lines are both good things. So you saw there aren't a lot of straight lines in this building, and that led to some challenges. There's a lot more custom fabrication in this building than in most buildings. So back to the airplane for a moment. That airplane, now is as good a time to talk about it as any. That airplane is the aircraft that is used to carry the spaceship to high altitude, to roughly 50,000 feet. And I'm going to show you a couple more pictures. So there it is in the air. So it's a very unusual aircraft. Again, the wingspan is comparable to a 737. It's not nearly as long as a 737. And it has this very unusual feature of 2 fuselages. So interestingly, the aircraft is controlled from the fuselage, from the pilot's perspective, the right side. On the left there, as we're seeing it from below. And the other side then is additional space that can be used for a variety of things. So this takes off with the spaceship slung in the middle, and it goes to high altitude, and then they separate. And here you can see what it looks like with the 2 attached. Now, very astute observers will notice that the spaceship in this particular case isn't really quite ready to fly because it does not have an engine nozzle sticking out the back, a rocket engine nozzle. But this is what it looks like as it takes off and flies up to high altitude for the separation. The other major structure that we have at the spaceport, I would say 2 major facilities and 1 slightly lesser facility. This is the second of the 2 major facilities. This is the building that we call the Spaceport Operations Center, better known as the SOC. So the original concept here was that this was going to be a rectangular fire station. And the director at that time thought that, a rectangular metal building isn't going to look very attractive next to that very iconic building that you saw there to the north, to the south, I should say, the previous building, the THF. So he wanted something that looked a little more iconic. And so he came up with the idea of the dome. And it turns out there are 2 or 3 companies around the country that can fabricate these kinds of domes. So it's a concrete dome. And the fire bays, there are those 3 bay doors that you see on the right side. Now, it turns out for this building to have enough overhead clearance to accommodate the requirements of the fire equipment, it needed to have a larger footprint. So roughly half of the building was available then for becoming our office space. So everything that you see on the right half is essentially fire station. Everything you see on the left half, and it's 2 floors in that portion, is actually the space that we use for our administrative offices, the state of New Mexico. So the area there, the eyebrow part that you see, is actually mission control. So that's our mission control, where we would typically be directing operations during aviation type missions. and other mission control requirements sometimes have us at the customer's location, but for a typical aviation mission, this is where you would find us. Then we do have a third structure. This one is relatively minor compared with the other two, but this is actually a fabric hangar. This has turned out to be an extremely useful workhorse building for us. Again, it's a fabric hangar, but it has that large door that the manufacturer refers to as the armadillo door that opens upward. So it opens to nearly the full width, and it's got good overhead clearance. And so we can put pretty good size aircraft in here as well. One of the things we've done with this building, and we'll get to that a little later as well, is we've used it to host some work that Boeing was doing in developing their space capsule that they're going to be using to transport astronauts to and from the space station. So again, just a couple more shots right now of the SOC and the fire equipment. We'll get into that a little bit more here in a few minutes. But again, there you can see the THF in the background, and you can see the SOC. So you can imagine a rectangular metal building wouldn't have been quite as attractive in that setting, and that was the reason for the dome again. So now we're back over at the THF, and we're inside. So the picture in the upper left-hand corner is actually inside the hangar. Again, a very large space. That is a replica of the Virgin Galactic spaceship that was in there for a while. With an airplane and one copy of the spaceship, and lots of workers as they work very determinedly to get to the first launch that we're expecting by the end of the year. The first launch from Spaceport America, that is. Again, the picture on the upper right was actually a banquet that we had in that building, in that area, that was associated with a student launch activity that we've been holding every year. And there again, you can see some of our open house activities. One of the things that we really like to do is reach out to kids. We feel like it's our responsibility to train our replacements. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this spaceport then. It's the world's first purpose-built commercial spaceport. So the other spaceports, the other commercial spaceports that are out there were originally Air Force bases, or they were in some cases NASA facilities that have been then repurposed for commercial purposes. And that's great, except for one thing. Sometimes the realities, the requirements for the military or government program were different. And so it doesn't necessarily fit their needs quite as well. And it's a little more difficult to be lean and mean. So we build ours with just the infrastructure that we require and not very much more, so that we can offer our customers really good pricing for having their launches take place at Spaceport America. So the spaceport concept here in New Mexico goes back to the early 90s, when some local visionaries realized that, hey, with White Sands Missile Range over there, with our sparse population, with all that airspace, with our great weather, with our ground elevation, and again, that proximity to White Sands Missile Range, that we have the ability to have a commercial spaceport here. So what they did is they lobbied the New Mexico State Legislature to actually provide some money to stand up this thing called the New Mexico Office for Space Commercialization, whose job it was to go out there, engage the market, and start the process of developing the spaceport as we know it. And so that's how it all progressed. So this large landmass with sparse population, there's an amusing story I like to tell. Before we had our license, we were hosting a delegation from the FAA, from the commercial space part of the FAA, which is called FAA AST, and they were giving us a lot of guidance on how to do certain kinds of things. And one of them is when we did the safety analysis, which is also called the location review for getting our license, one of the things you have to do is take into consideration the population. So they were describing the methodology that they wanted us to use, which is to take the census blocks, the smallest division of census data, and assume that the population within each block was uniformly distributed, then intersect those blocks with the hazard area, and that's how we would count the people who were at risk. And so I said, well, why would we do that? Because we know exactly where both of the people live. And they thought I was being flippant, but at the time that was true. There were two people that lived within the hazard area. So again, that is an incredible advantage for us. And I'll show you a picture in a little while that explains that. Another element is the weather. Here in southern New Mexico, the weather is very rarely so hot and almost never so cold that you can't work outdoors productively. So it's a great thing that we have if you need to be out working on your space vehicle. At some point, every space vehicle is going to be outdoors. And to be able to do that at almost any time of the year, very little rainfall, so very few disruptions because of weather, and temperatures, which are really quite moderate, that's a great thing for us. The elevation is important. So our ground elevation here is about 4,600 feet. So people like to say the first mile is free, and that's kind of true, but that's only part of the story. The lift necessary to get you up that first 4,600 feet has been done by ground vehicles. But on the other hand, the sparser air that we have here means that the air doesn't push back as hard. So we have less drag that reduces the magnitude of maximum dynamic pressure. It does a lot of other good things. And one of the things that's rarely thought about is it can actually, if taken into consideration properly, it can actually improve the performance of engines by making them, designing them so that they're a better fit to the overall average pressure. So anyway, we get a lot of advantages from that. So back, one of the programs that we were pursuing many years ago was a very large program. And in general, for many space launches, southerliness, in the US that is, close proximity to the equator, but for the US it's southerliness and ground elevation are both important. So our ground elevation actually won out over the fact that Florida is farther south from us for that particular program. So again, very important. So we were originally pursuing these large programs. One of them that we were pursuing in the late 1990s was the Lockheed Martin Venture Star program. So NASA had actually started this program called the X-33, which was to develop and demonstrate the technologies for a single-staged orbit. So as you know, everything we launch to orbit today has a stage, at least one stage that falls off on the way up. So single stage to orbit is sort of like a holy grail, and they wanted to pursue that. And so Lockheed then won the contract, and it intended to commercialize that technology, and they wanted to operate it from Spaceport America. So we were very pleased about that. But unfortunately, NASA pulled the plug on the program, leading Lockheed to pull the plug on their program. And so that left us kind of high and dry. So we decided at that point to refocus on the emerging space tourism and low-cost commercial research markets that were then really starting to come into their own. And that's how Spaceport America, as we know it today, came into being. So we've been really quite busy. We launched our first rocket in 2006. We've had 60 launches to date, plus an additional 246 launches that take place during a student launch event that we host every June until this year because of the COVID situation. And we have a number of tenants. Virgin Galactic, everybody knows about, but we have a company called Up Aerospace, which is from the Denver area, Exos Aerospace, which is from the Dallas area, and Energetics, which is from Washington State. And then we distinguish between tenants and customers. Customers are companies that come in and do their thing and then go back home. Tenants are those who have a permanent presence. All right, so again, we have an FAA license, and that says that that anybody who wants to launch a vehicle that requires a license can launch it from our location, but they also have to demonstrate that it's safe to do so as part of their license operation. We have 18,000 acres of state land. We have access to 6,000 miles of airspace. We have a 200 foot by 12,000 foot runway, and we also have 3 vertical launch complexes. And again, that low population density, that leads to a low parameter called E sub C, the casualty expectation. So it is a parameter that has to be less than 10 to the minus 4th. And it's hard to visualize in that sense, but the easier way to think about it is we're allowed 1 casualty every 10,000 missions. So that's the way it sort of all fits in an easier to understand way. We have great weather here, again, lots of sunshine, so it facilitates our operations. But since we are kind of a small city out in the middle of nowhere, we're 45 minutes from the nearest emergency response. We do have to have a fire department. We do have to have emergency medical technicians. We have to have border security, boundary security. So we have all of those things here at the spaceport. This is one of our fire engines. This is the ARF truck. This is the one that's generally used for fighting aviation fires in the event of a crash. We have a structure engine for fighting building fires. We have a brush truck because one of the hazards here in the desert are brush fires, grass fires. So we have this truck, and then we also have an ambulance. So at any time, we have 6 firefighters on station, and normally our firefighters, at least 4 of them, are qualified emergency medical technicians as well. And I feel great confidence in saying that we saved a man's life once who had a heart attack. He was a visitor to our site, but he had a heart attack. And our emergency medical support was only 3 minutes away. I don't think if he'd gotten the typical 10-minute response that you see even in a large city, that he would have survived. But we had him on oxygen. One of our employees was an expert in CPR, and between his quick response and getting the gentleman on oxygen quickly, we saved his life. So spaceports are numerous and growing, but many of them are dedicated for specific operations. So, for example, in West Texas, there's the Blue Origin launch site, and that's reserved for their operations only. SpaceX has 2 sites in Texas. One is the launch site that they're developing down in the extreme southern part of the state, and then the one near McGregor, which is where they do a lot of their testing. Some of these facilities like Wallops and the Florida Space Complex are very busy, California as well, but many of the other spaceports really don't have a lot of business yet. So we feel very fortunate because we do have a lot of customers here at Spaceport America. And again, I mentioned the airspace. So the airspace is large, but it also has one other great advantage, and that is that it is actually controlled by the U.S. Army. So we don't really have to have any involvement of the FAA in a lot of what we do. It's a much easier process than almost everywhere else in the U.S. The only 2 places in the country where this is true are White Sands Missile Range and the Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C. So to give you an idea why that's important, this is a snapshot. Now, this would have been pre-COVID, of course, but this is a snapshot at a relatively busy time. Each one of those little airplanes represents a commercial flight, an aircraft equipped with ADS-B, which are mostly commercial aircraft. So you can see there I hope you can see my cursor, there in the southern New Mexico area, that's the White Sands Missile Range shadow. Since that airspace is restricted, the aircraft don't go over it, they go around it. There's another area in California near the Mojave and the China Lake complexes and Edwards Air Force Base. And there are other areas in the country without very much air traffic. But as you get farther north, then you have to deal with that thing called winter. So we think we're kind of in an optimum location. And I mentioned safety. So here's an example of why that low E sub C is so important. This was the rocket going up. This was the rocket when the parachute didn't open on the descent. So it hit the ground very hard, but you notice in the background there, you don't see a lot of houses or anything. And in fact, the one house which is occupied in the area, we have an agreement with those people, the ranchers that actually run cattle on this land, and they actually leave the area when we're doing these things. So even if it had hit their house, no one would have been injured. But again, in a typical metropolitan area, there would be at least tens of thousands of people within 7 kilometers, 5 miles of this launch site. But we can guarantee that the only people that are within those 5 miles are people who are directly associated with the launch. And under the FAA rules, we're considered expendable. So current and future growth. So right now, Spaceport America only launches suborbitally. Things go up and they immediately come back down. So getting to space is about going high. You need to go 100 kilometers to the Kármán line to meet the international definition of being in space. Now, unfortunately, that's a lot easier to do than getting to orbit. So space is about altitude, orbit is about speed. So the highest speed achieved by any of the rockets that we launch at Spaceport America currently is about 3,500 miles per hour. To get to orbit, you need to go 17,500 miles per hour, which is 5 times faster. And I'm sure everybody's taken physics. And so you know that the kinetic energy of an object in motion scales as the square of the velocity. So you need 25 times as much energy to reach orbit as what it takes to reach suborbit with the rockets that we fly. And that's why orbit is such a difficult thing to achieve. That's why it took SpaceX several attempts before they got there. That's why there are many companies that have tried and have never gotten there. So again, space is hard, and that velocity requirement for orbit is one of the reasons. So right now, again, we're still focused on suborbit and space tourism. There's lots of research opportunities, and our customers, our launch customers, are using those. But in the future, we think that when the technologies are right, that we will be able to fly to orbit from an inland location, such as our spaceport. Certain space planes, and if we ever get to single stage orbit, some returnable boosters perhaps will get us there. SpaceX has been having great success with returnable boosters, but if you ever watch the videos, you notice right now it's not quite ready for that, because that separation event, when the booster separates, there's a fair amount of debris that comes off from that. And will never be acceptable for that to just fall in an arbitrary location. So why is there a market for suborbital launch? A lot of it has to do with microgravity research. It's a very low-cost means of testing things that are intended to go, say, to the space station before actually committing to doing the full design. So we're in a great place to do that. We can get the altitude that we need to get long exposure to microgravity. And one of our customers hosts a lot of medical experiments. I can't name the medical research facility that they work with, but they have been doing some tests of finding better ways to actually construct artificial organs by using the microgravity environment. They've been doing some tests on the behavior of different types of cells. So this is something I think which in the long term potentially is going to lead to great medical advances. Another area of great research is in crystal growth. Without the influence of gravity, crystals can be produced that are much better than they would be otherwise. So if we could in the future perhaps make our semiconductor substrates in microgravity, we would find that we could have probably faster and lower power consumption computers. So my belief is that humans are smart enough. If there is a will, there is a way, and we will find it. And I think in the future that will happen. We also know that there's a lot of medical research still needs to be done if we're ever going to get to Mars. So those are some of the things. So this next video I want to show you is a video that was shot at Spaceport America, and this is just one of the very best pieces of space video I've ever seen. So I'm going to try to talk over the music here and tell you what's going on. So we're going to watch this rocket, launches from the ground. It takes off very fast. Now we're going to watch the rocket from a camera on the rocket looking back at the ground, and you notice it starts to spin. This is like many rockets, it's spin stabilized. Now we'll watch from the ground again. So this rocket exhausts its fuel in only 12 seconds, and after that, it's still there coasting to space, but you can't see it because it's not making smoke anymore. So now the nose cone has come off the rocket, and now what we're doing is we're looking back along the fuselage. It's as if we were looking at a pencil from the end. And now the next thing we're going to see is the main experiment that was on this rocket. It needed to be out in space on its own. It's a reentry object that NASA's developing to bring things back on demand from the space station. And then finally, this is the $1 million piece of video right here. The camera actually captured the separation event where the booster is separated from the motor. So the avionics and payload section is the large piece there in the middle, and it comes down with a parachute. But the booster can't be reused, and so it comes down without a parachute. So I'm going to stop that and move on. So recent commercial launches. Our recent commercial launches, we have a pretty busy schedule. So last year, well, this is just the last 2 or 3 years. We haven't had very many this year because of COVID. It's affected everybody, including our customers. But Exos has launched 4 times. Up Aerospace has launched 3 times in the last couple of years. We have a startup company called Sugar House Aerospace. It's the lone commercial launch that we've actually hosted this year. And again, the COVID restrictions are the reason for that. Another area that we've been doing a lot of work with, as I mentioned, is with Boeing on this capsule development. So the capsule that they launched to space to transport astronauts to the space station under contract with NASA, if you're going to get in that thing, you're going to want to make sure, you're going to want to have good confidence that those parachutes are going to work on descent. So they need to be tested. Well, how do you test parachutes that'll be deployed at altitudes higher than you can get with an aircraft? Well, you do it with a high altitude balloon. And so we actually hosted some of them. Some of them were done at White Sands Missile Range. And here's a video that shows you one of those tests. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. where's lost my cursor. Well, this is supposed to be a video. There it goes. All right. So again, that balloon is around 150 feet high, and it has about $100,000 worth of helium in it. And it carried this capsule up to about 40,000 feet, and then it separated. So in the lower left-hand corner, you can see it, a thumbnail view, and then you can see it. So now the balloon would be a hazard to aircraft, and so it has to be opened up so that the helium is released and it comes down within a safe area. So now this thing is falling, and it's going through the full parachute deployment sequence. So the 2 drogue parachutes, and now the 3 main parachutes, and you're going to watch them fully open. And then you'll see it land gently out in the New Mexico desert. So these parachutes, in order to get them properly deployed, they're actually deployed with something which is almost like a cannon. It's actually probably closer to a military mortar, but they're actually fired out so that they get out of the airstream and can properly deploy. And then you can see they take a fair amount of time to fully open. And once they're fully open, you know, if you're one of those few astronauts sitting in that capsule and you look up through that window, the prettiest sight you can imagine is going to be 3 good parachutes up there above you. And again, we hosted 3 of these, and White Sands Missile Range hosted 5 of them. And now the capsule's qualified. It has actually flown 1 mission. There's going to be another mission, I think, early next year, and then it'll be cleared to carry astronauts. So that'll be happening soon. All right. Another area that we're doing now is rocket motor manufacturing at the spaceport. So one of our customers that I mentioned before, Up Aerospace, they fly a solid booster rocket, and they used to manufacture those at an off-site location, but they were in the market for a closer facility to manufacture them. And so we actually had a building that was suitable for that purpose. And so beginning about 3 years ago, they started actually manufacturing them here. And this is actually a static test of one of those motors. So these solid motors burn what's in the business is referred to as ammonium perchlorate composite propellant. It's the same basic formulation that was used in the space shuttle solid boosters, almost any solid boosters. It's the highest performing solid propellant which is generally available, and occasionally they do these tests. So again, this motor burns only 12 seconds, and in that 12 seconds, it accelerates the rocket from 0 to 3,500 miles per hour and moving fast enough that it can coast on up to altitudes of about 75 miles. Very, very impressive performance. And we also continue to pursue other new types of programs. So one of them that's under development, on again, off again development, depending on various government agencies' interest in it, is a reusable booster system. So this is one of the most recent ones. We were in the running to host this program from Boeing, which was called the Experimental Space Plane, ESP. So this was a Boeing program funded by DARPA, and the plan was that this would be launched vertically like a rocket. It would come back like the space shuttle, but it would be able to launch satellites with a very fast turnaround and at very low cost. And we were hoping to host it, but unfortunately, that, like many government programs, it was canceled before they actually had anything ready to fly. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about Virgin Galactic and their program. So I got a little video about that. So we had hoped to actually have a Virgin participant in this panel, but unfortunately, because of the nature of their business, the fact that they're getting ready to hopefully have a launch, the first human space flight from New Mexico by the end of this year, they are very busy, and we weren't able to find somebody who had the time to participate. But here's a little video that will show you the preparation and some things about the previous powered flight that they did to space. This was their second flight to space. So those are 2 of the pilots, Mike Masucci, that's Beth Moses. So she's a Virgin Galactic employee who was actually an astronaut. She flew in the back seat. And there you can see the aircraft. Now, this took place in California. So the next time this happens, it's going to be right here in New Mexico. it takes off, and again, it's an airplane, very high performance at low altitude, but it struggles once it gets up to 50,000 feet. Not many airplanes do well at those altitudes. And again, this was in February.
3, 2, 1,
So
release.
there you see the drop away, and then it lights its engine. The engine burns for about a minute, propels it up to about 330,000 feet or so, high, well above the Kármán line to make space, or close to the Kármán line. And then you can see the looking back along the rocket as the Earth appears to pull away from it. Now, this spaceship has this really interesting capability. So the wing feathers. So what that does is it ensures that if the aircraft, if the space vehicle is coming back in some inopportune orientation, it's like a badminton shuttlecock that self-orients and gets it into proper attitude for flying. So once it's back in the atmosphere, the wing goes back to normal position. It becomes a glider and lands on the runway. So that's Dave Mackay, who's one of their pilots, and he's a Scot, and hence the bagpipes. Mike Masucci, and then Beth. Those were the 3 occupants of the spaceship on that particular mission. And again, we'll be doing this from New Mexico, we hope within the next 2 months. Oops. Okay, now a few more things that we do. We do a lot of STEM outreach. I have the privilege of doing much of that. We take our STEM thing on the road sometimes. We go to lots of schools. Every Las Cruces public school, 6th grade in the entire system last year and for the previous 4 years that I visited and do some experiments to the kids. You know, we've identified the middle school years as the years when you have to capture kids' science and engineering interest. And if you do that, then sometimes you can make them go into those careers. So that's what we do. We try to have a really interesting show for them. Then we also, one of our biggest STEM events is what we call the Spaceport America Cup, but it's co-branded by our partner as the Intercollegiate Rocket Engineering Competition. So we've held it for 3 years. We would have held it this year again, but unfortunately COVID got in the way. But we've had, in the last 2 years that we did hold the event, we had 120 or so teams, mostly from the US, but many from Canada, from Latin America, from Europe, from all parts of the world. And they come and have this competition. So they build their rockets and they come and have the competition. So space, we don't always think about it that way, but space is really about precision. You know, you can launch something to orbit, but if it's not the orbit that you wanted, you may have wasted a satellite. You may have wasted a rocket. So it's about precision. So the competition is all about hitting your predictions. So they are required to predict the performance of their rocket, and then those that come closest to to meeting their predictions are the category winners, and then the overall winner is selected from that group. So we also do many individual student launches. This is the cup. This isn't everybody, but this is most of the participants. It was well over 1,000 kids that participated this year, in that particular year. This was a little over a year ago. And you see all those rockets. But we also have hosted rocket launches from our local university, New Mexico State, from UNM, the other large university in the state of New Mexico. And when we have these events, you know, the spaceport really was developed as an economic development project. And so we fill lots of hotel rooms, we sell lots of restaurant meals, and so we have great impact on the economy of the area. As far as other STEM launches, we believe USC in 2019, University of Southern California, became the first university to launch a rocket above the Kármán line, above 100 kilometers. So that's an exciting thing that we've done with our STEM program. Again, New Mexico Tech, the third research university in the state of New Mexico, has launched here 5 times. And they also are all about precision. So they go out there, they design their rocket, and they predict its performance. And they're very, very good now at predicting how well it performs. So in 2019, we had all these student launches. And in 2020, we had a comparable number planned, but as you can see, we only had 2 of them because most of the schools, the schools closed down, the students weren't available to work on their rockets. So we're hoping that as soon as COVID is behind us, that we will resume that track and get those students going again. Again, just a little bit more about the economic benefits. So since 2010, Virgin has spent over $11 million in this area with many, many different suppliers, some of which are listed here. So the total in-state spend is about $22.5 million to date, which does not even include the salaries from the staff that are based here. So we think that space is a very important source of economic development in New Mexico, and that's why we're so much behind this program. And just a group of some of our staff that were out there one day, and we shot this picture to give you some idea of what it looks like to be out there near that very iconic building. All right, so now if anyone has a few questions, I'd be happy to try to entertain them. I think we're about on track. Let me get out of this so I can see my screen. And let's see, where's the chat screen?
All right, Dr. Gutman, thank you so much. I think here's some of the questions. Can you share more about your partnership with Virgin? Was one of the questions I see.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So Virgin Galactic came into being when Sir Richard Branson, he dreamed up the idea of having a commercial space company. But in 2004, there was this thing called the X Prize. And it was a $10 million prize paid to the first non-government agency, non-government entity that successfully flew to space, meaning above the Kármán line, twice in 2 weeks. So a company called Scaled Composites that many of you probably have heard of at least, formed a joint venture with some other folks, and they built such a vehicle and they claimed the prize in 2004. So Sir Richard Branson then stepped in and wanted to license that technology then to use it to take tourists to space. So New Mexico saw its opening. They were doing their testing in Mojave, California, but we realized that that's not really a very good place for it because the airspace there is much more congested than here. So we were able to show Virgin the case for why New Mexico is a much more natural place to host the actual operational program. And so we developed a program with them, a partnership, whereby they would develop the space vehicle and we would develop the space port for that purpose. And so the state of New Mexico invested about $220 million in developing the spaceport. Almost all the money, most of the money came directly from the state government, although about $60 million of that came from 2 local counties, which agreed to tax themselves to raise the additional money. And then Virgin Galactic is owned by the Virgin Group, and they were able to raise the money internally, which is far more than our $220 million to actually develop the spaceship. So we've had this partnership now, which is more than 10 years old, and it's finally about to come to fruition when they actually start flying to space here.
Does the government ever have to coordinate with Mexico since they're so close for the airspace?
Okay, so that's a good question. It turns out that the answer is no. We're actually about, I guess we're probably, let me think about it for a minute. We're about 75 miles from the Mexican border. So other than an incident that I've never actually heard anybody that participated in it, there was an incident from White Sands Missile Range back in the 1950s where something landed in Mexico. I believe that's the only time that's ever happened. So fortunately, we don't have to coordinate with Mexico, but we do have to coordinate with the FAA. Everything that we launch at Spaceport America is either licensed by the FAA or flies under something called a waiver from the FAA. So smaller rockets don't have to be licensed, but they still can only be flown with permission from the FAA. And in spite of the fact that we're doing this in restricted airspace, where we know there are no other aircraft, still the law requires that we do that coordination with the FAA. So we always do that with our launches. And so far we have a unblemished safety record. We've never hurt anybody. We've probably scared a couple of cows on launch, but that's about the worst casualty I think that we've had so far.
Is the facility open to the public for tours at all?
So right now, the facility, our tours are shut down because of COVID, but normally we do have a tour program. We call them terrestrial tourists. So we normally do have a tour program that can be, if you go to our website, spaceportamerica.com, there is a link to the tours and you can make reservations. So if you're going to be in the area, you can actually make reservations. Now, we actually charge for the tour because unfortunately, it does involve a bus trip. The spaceport's pretty far from everything. And so to minimize environmental effects of our project, one of the things that we do is we try to minimize vehicle traffic. And so that means that our tours, for the most part, meet in one of the nearby towns, and then people come out by bus. So the cost of the tour largely takes care of the cost of that.
Are there any special environmental or air quality issues concerning the launches, like exotic exhaust chemicals?
Okay, great question. So it turns out that, the answer to that is yes, there are. So some rockets produce pretty benign exhaust constituents, CO2 and water vapor. So if we have a rocket that burns kerosene and liquid oxygen, or a rocket that burns even the Virgin Galactic hybrid engine, the chemicals, the gases that it emits are relatively benign. And so there's not much of a concern there. But now when we burn the solid rocket boosters, they actually release particulate, very finely divided aluminum oxide particles, which are an inhalation hazard, and they also produce a certain amount of hydrogen chloride. So in preparation for the licensing of the spaceport, we did an environmental impact statement, and we analyzed the worst case scenarios in terms of the release of those chemicals. And so we have limits on how much we can do, but if we stay within those limits, the amount of release and the dispersion of those constituents is such that there's no real hazard associated with it. Now, having said all that, interestingly, when you do an environmental impact statement, there's usually one or two issues that come to the forefront. And in our particular case, the biggest issue became something called El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. There was an old Spanish trail during Spanish colonial times, which actually continued to be used up until about 100 years ago when the railroad finally took over, which was the main avenue of transportation between Mexico City and Santa Fe, which was the provincial capital of New Spain. And that old trail, which, would have had foot traffic, wagon traffic, ox carts and cattle, herd animals and so on. The desire was to preserve as much as possible sort of the historic feel of that trail. And so one of the things that we do at our facility is we try to make all of the buildings blend in as much as possible with the surroundings. So when possible, we hide the buildings behind high ground. So for example, every engineer knows that you put your water tower on the highest ground that you have. Well, we didn't. We hid ours behind the highest ground so that it can't be seen from the trail. So those are the kinds of accommodations that we have to make here in meeting those environmental commitments that we made.
What is the long-term profitability of this facility project?
So that's a really interesting question. There are various sides to that discussion. But one side is that, hey, this is like a highway or like an airport where it doesn't directly produce profits, but the commerce and the employment that it enables are what actually make it highly beneficial to the area. There's another contingent on that discussion that says, yeah, it can make money. So I tend to believe it's more like Interstate 10 in terms of its value. But again, we have over 100 people here working here now, and these are all high-paid. The Virgin Galactic jobs are high-paid jobs. These are people with great skill sets, and that's a lot of money coming into the area. They've bought nice houses. They've really driven the economy here in southern New Mexico. What
was the overall cost for the spaceport?
Okay, so the official number right now is, I believe it's $224 million. And, much of that you can see in the form of a runway and the buildings and all those things, but much of it you can't see because some of it is buried under the ground. It's the utility infrastructure. It's things like that. So the total cost right now is around $224 million.
Gotcha. We got about 2 more minutes left.
Okay.
I had a question. Once they start commercial trips into space, how long will those folks be in space before they come back down?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So the total duration of a mission will be between 1.5 and 2 hours, depending on weather conditions and a variety of things. But the actual space part of the mission is only about 15 minutes. So when the spaceship separates from the aircraft, it lights its engine, and it's in space in about 2 minutes. And then it's going to come back down and land. So it's going to go up and come down pretty fast, and then it will actually come back and land as a glider. So much of the time, much of that 15 minutes or so is actually the descent as a unpowered aircraft. So it's the total time in space is probably, in microgravity, it's 2 or 3 minutes. In space, it's probably about the same. Total duration about 15 minutes. And that's discounting the time in the airplane, the time when you're being carried by the airplane.
Gotcha. All right, last question. What is the runway length out there?
The runway is 12,000 feet. And interestingly, at our 4,600 feet of elevation, we routinely see density altitudes in the summertime of approaching 10,000 feet. So 12,000 feet of runway is a really nice thing to have. And especially with the Virgin Galactic, the returning spaceship, it only has one chance to land. And so having a long runway is highly beneficial from that point of view. And it's also 200 feet wide, 50 feet wider than most runways.
Well, Dr. Gutman, I really appreciate you joining us today all the way from New Mexico. We've enjoyed hearing from you about Spaceport, and hopefully some of us will get a chance to get out there and check it out. It seems like a really neat project. Thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to have you.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.